for the Old Sword Club. So for those who don't know me before, I'm Tim. I do stuff with the Old Sword Club, but today I'm joined by Adamiri or Mansamiri, which is just, I really love the nickname. It's just awesome. Who's going to talk to us about historical African martial arts. So yeah, probably just to start off with, just so that we're getting a bit of a background about what everything is. What is HAMA, or what is historical African martial arts? Like,
oh sure, I can answer that for you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off. You were finishing the question?
No, I was just saying, what's HAMA? Just go for it.
Okay, so historical African martial arts refers to a category of martial systems that originated in Africa or from the African diaspora. What we find as historical is anything going back from World War II into as far back as we can trace it into antiquity. So the reason why we stop at World War II is because if you look at the Italo-Ethiopian War, that was essentially the last time what we would view as traditional warriors went off into battle. So anything from that point going back. There are living traditions that we do study from, but those are all rooted in those ancient traditions as well. So in short, historical African martial arts is an effort to either retain the traditional arts that exist now, or to revive ones that have seemed to have gone into obscurity, and we have maybe some remnants of it in texts or in living arts.
Okay, cool. And it's really, really interesting that you actually look at living traditions, I guess, compared to, say, HEMA. Like, HEMA really tries to differentiate itself from living traditions of European martial arts. So it's kind of, I find that's really, really interesting. And is that sort of a product of like differences in culture, or like, you know, there's been more of an effort to preserve traditional practices in Africa, or is like what, or like, I guess kind of what kind of motivated that?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is that these are traditions that have endured for a very long time. And so, for example, you look at Egyptian stick fighting, or Tahtib. The stick fighting system of Tahtib has been around since the pharaohs. Now, it's obviously changed over time, but the foundational elements of that martial art are still there. And so you can look at what is in the Egyptian texts, so the hieroglyphs or what have you, and then try to compare that to what is there in the living tradition. And then through understanding those two, you can bridge the gap. Another reason is that they are steeped in these traditions. And so learning, for example, Senegalese wrestling, you are practicing a tradition that has been around for a very long time. So it's both sort of our frog DNA for what we have written down, or what we have sort of left, but it's also living traditions that have still maintained their cultural relevance and practices over time. So it's a little bit of both.
I think that's really, really cool. Yeah, saying, I guess sort of the comparison. Yeah, it's really, really interesting that you have like those sort of those traditions and essentially like an oral history of martial arts, which is just like, I know. I guess just as a historian, I find that really, really interesting. We should probably specify what frog DNA is, though, because there are people I've met people who have just not got that reference. So
okay, I'm aging myself, aren't I?
I'm aging myself. No, it's a weird. Yeah, it's a weird one. I've met 20-year-olds who are just like, what do you mean by frog DNA? Because like they never saw Jurassic Park. Although Jurassic Park is something they've heard of, but they never really, it wasn't as big deal growing up for them. Whereas,
right,
yeah, I don't have it here, but I actually have like a proper dinosaur from the merchandise line. So, yeah. So yeah, frog DNA being basically just wherever there's a gap in like a source, is you just take something from a function, like from a functional martial art. Do you find that it makes the reconstructive process easier, that you can take, like, that your frog DNA is coming from living traditions, like you go, like living from traditions from, if not the same culture, from at least much more similar cultures?
It does, but we also have to be intellectually honest about it. So I'll give you an example for my particular area of study. So for my particular area of study, I look at North Africa. And we are currently actively working on reconstructing North African saber, which largely functionally has been a success. We have put together something where you can apply the use of the nimcha or the shamshir or the flissa in a way that is functional in a sparring environment. Now, how we managed to put that together, it's twofold. First, we have what is available in English for the swordsmanship of North Africa, like, for example, the Mamluks. We'll take that as an example. We have a couple of sword exercises that are available in English. And then that, of course, bleeds into the Mamluk project that we're working on right now. Now, on the other hand, we also have some historical accounts, for example, in books like Swordsmen of the British Empire, where they're showing how people in the Ottoman Empire would have done sword exercises. Now, on the other hand, we have a stick fighting art called El Matreg, which is a folk stick fighting system that in not antiquity, sorry, in the Middle Ages, was used to teach common boys how to fight with swords. So a lot of the movements that you find in El Matreg, you find them manifested in those swordsmanship styles. And you find a similar approach in Persia and in other parts of that sort of region of the world, or the Middle East, North Africa, or the Swana region. So what we can do is we can say, okay, we have these particular exercises that we can practice, and then we have this particular martial art that has the mechanics. So we just take the mechanics and we apply them to the exercises. And in this particular case, they work very well. But you have other situations where we're trying to reconstruct the martial weapon systems of Central Africa, and we don't have as many written sources about the way that they would have fought back then. Nothing that really came of any value from European sources that we've seen so far. And again, because many of these societies were oral and not literate. So what didn't survive, for example, the Belgian Congo, because a lot of the warriors of Central Africa ended up dying during Leopold's quest for rubber, a lot of those traditions didn't survive. But we do know that, for example, there are similar cultures that would be identified as Bantu who have a very similar approach to stick fighting and weapons in general. So we can take, for example, what the Nyangatam do, how they do their stick fighting, or what the Zulu might do, or the Xhosa might do with their stick fighting. And we try to see if we can apply that to the weapon set that was being used in the Congo. And in some cases, it makes sense because the weapons might be of a similar size or shape. But in other cases, it doesn't work at all because the weapons just don't apply in that particular context. And then we have to go back to the drawing board and figure out where we can find something similar enough to give us an understanding of how the weapon is used.
Yeah, and get so there's a big more emphasis on having like a functional sense of what you do with the weapon. Even if you don't have a specific kind of like written source or a specific kind of oral tradition, you can still kind of it's used for frog DNA it together. That's really cool. Yeah, I'd say, I guess that's a sort of a problem for a lot of historical martial arts. I mean, European martial arts, there are some cases really quite significant gaps. We know very, very little about, particularly like working class knife traditions. We have one source from Spain, even though we know like knife dueling was really common all around the Mediterranean. Same with basically pre-19th century stick fighting. We know about it from Britain because it was a spectator sport, but French Lacan is based on provincial sort of stick fighting, but we don't have any sources for it at all. So I guess that sort of, that sort of seems to be lack of sources just kind of seems to be, a constant issue for any kind of historical martial art. One thing I was very curious about with the written sources you do have, what languages are they in? Because I imagine that could be quite difficult as well.
So for the main sources that we're using right now, they're in Arabic, or specifically Masri Arabic. So this will bleed into the Mamluk project that we're working on right now, and that's to translate this book called Kitab al-Maskhun Jami' al-Funun. It's a mouthful, I know. And this particular, I stumbled over it the first 8 times I tried to say it properly. But this particular book is was believed to have been completed in 1470. And the reason I say completed is because we believe that some pages or some sections come from earlier century. That just kind of carried forward because they worked, and the book was just added on to. And so this book is written. This book is written in what we believe to be 15th century Masri Arabic, and basically we can't. Obviously, I can't read Arabic, and there are lots of people in the Western world who can't read Arabic. And for some people, to give you an idea of the difference in the language, it would be like somebody trying to read Shakespeare who's not familiar with it, if we're looking for just anybody who speaks Arabic to translate it. And it's not what you would call Fusha. Fusha is a dialect of Arabic that's considered to be sort of the classical, high-level, academic, traditional Arabic that hasn't changed since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, right? So we're in the process of getting that book translated into English. And we've been at it for a couple of years now. Largely because the translation isn't just translating it word for word. We're also looking at meanings, context. Sometimes there are military terms that don't exist in modern Arabic that you have to look at 3 and 4 and 5 different textbooks to look at. And so that's what we're looking at in terms of this particular process. And we know that there are other sources like Nikiyat al-Sul, which is also written in Arabic. There are others that we're still looking for, and it's just a question of finding them. I mean, we're sure that, for example, the thousands of manuscripts they have in Timbuktu, some of them are probably military manuals. They just haven't translated them yet.
No, I was actually going to bring up Timbuktu because it's, I heard about that very recently. It's this massive library, and it's like sort of, people talk about the Library of Alexandria, but so even in Europe in the Middle Ages, they recognized Timbuktu as this great center of learning, and then there's not very much of it has actually been translated. And I think last I heard, they're also quite like the people who maintain the library today are very, very reluctant to digitize. So sort of So it's just sort of this great thing where it's like there's so much stuff there that would just be so amazing to actually be able to go in and translate. So when you're talking about like Arabic, is that mainly because your focus is on North Africa, and there's kinds of other sort of historical traditions that differ depending on where you go, or is it mostly oral histories outside of sort of the further you get from the Mediterranean?
It depends. And I say this because there are books, for example, in Ethiopia that are in Amharic that have just not been translated to English. And it's one of those unknown, right? I mean, we have books like the Kebra Nagast and others that, depict battles and the histories and all of these other things. And we do know that in Ethiopia, for example, there was an elite sort of knightly class, similar to the European knight or the Japanese samurai. But, because those of us who do not speak Amharic or Gez can't access that material, there isn't really much that we can say about it. So that's kind of where we're at with this. So we know that there are some areas in Africa that have more oral history than others, but there are other areas that were very literate. So Timbuktu is an example, Ethiopia is an example, Somalia is an example, and it's just a question of trying to tease out those sources. But as far as Arabic being as ubiquitous as it is, there's a lot of reasons for that. Arabic itself, both in script and in the spoken word, was fairly ubiquitous as a writing system and as a lingua franca, going from parts of the northern parts of West Africa all the way down across the north through the Swahili coast. And that's because of trade, people who converted to Islam, and some people just decided to use Arabic because the alphabet was simpler to use than some of the traditional symbolism that was used to convey meanings. For example, in Ghana, you had an amulet that you would give to somebody, and that amulet would say whether or not you're going to war or whether or not somebody is coming. And it's much easier to just write a letter than have a golden amulet forged and then carried across the country, where it might get stolen by bandits and melted into jewelry, right? So things like that would be considered. It's often said that Arabic is looked at as the Latin of Africa, just because it was just so easy for people who were part of the same religion to just use the language or use the script.
Yeah, sort of Yeah, and that was a big thing. So, like, you know, when you mentioned sort of like when you mentioned North America as well, I thought, you know, my first thought was of Mansa Musa, who famously, you know, on the Hajj crashed the economies of multiple different countries by just flooding it with gold. So yeah, so kind of yeah, that's interesting. And so yeah, you've got like sort of an extra level of problem where, or like not problem, but like, you know, challenge where, you know, you've got to translate languages. In some cases, languages that I imagine there'd be stuff in languages that are not spoken anymore. I mean, I remember years and years and years ago at my university, there was great pride taken the fact that Macquarie was the only university, was like one of 3 universities in the world that had a department for was actually one of the Ethiopian language, a medieval Ethiopian language that is not spoken, like that basically died out. That is very, very important for, because there's a lot of sources written in it. And like, looking at Hamer, I'm like, wow, there's like a lot of sort of, you know, you'd sort of have a lot more, like a lot greater challenges in terms of just accessing stuff. So it's really, really cool, like just hearing about how you approach that. Do you find you can get a lot of engagement for this from universities or academic institutions that might have these documents, or is it more sort of, you know, just going like sort of trying to, you know, is it more sort of just trying to sort of piece together what you can get, or just rocking up and get, you know?
Well, fortunately, there are a lot of people who are on a university level who are really interested in very niche aspects of African martial arts or African history. One of my favorites to talk about is, for example, the Mamluk Lancer, which is an English translation of a few chapters of the manual Nehiat al-Sul. And this was done by Kirsty Jensen at the University of Oslo. And this particular paper has been invaluable, for example, in my reconstruction of spear and shield work. And then, you know, you have other things like the Mamluk Studies Review for this university in the United States, and they just have journal after journal after journal of things that you can read. You also have independent people who have written books. There's one called Fighting for Honor. The name of the author is escaping my mind right now. But this is a book that covers the various martial skills that were practiced throughout the continent, both in literate and oral societies. So we do have some people who, you know, through their research at their universities have produced material that we can study from. But then there are also people who maybe after they've done their doctorate, they're still interested in the study, they produce additional knowledge. And fortunately, also we get engagement from living masters as well. So we sort of have all of these different sources that we can pull from.
Yeah, it's really cool because you know, there's been a lot of interest. There's been news I can tell of increasing interest in African martial arts, like living tradition African martial arts over the last few years. Like basically since Black Panther came out, people have been interested in that, which is pretty cool. But yeah, so do you? And so a lot of these traditions are not. Like things like Dambe and the Senegalese wrestling, that they are, you know, combat sports. Do you get a lot of interest from like promoters and from people who are interested in, you know, like getting international attention from the sport? Like, do you get a lot of people sort of coming to you from that perspective?
Well, it depends on what the specific system is and who sort of is having the conversation. Because, I mean, the Ham Association isn't the only organization out there that focuses on African martial arts in general or in specificity. For example, you have Modern Tahtib, where I actually learned Egyptian stick fighting. And they've done work with UNESCO, they've worked with the Paris Martial Arts Conference, and right now they're working on a project to get the martial art into the Olympics. So in that respect, Modern Tahtib is, you know, out there getting international acclaim. They're practiced in 7 countries now. And then you have other things like, you know, Dambe, you know, is obviously getting more attention. You have wrestlers from Senegal who are now making their way into the world of mixed martial arts. You know, Rug is a favorite of mine. If you've ever seen his matches, this guy is an absolute unit and throws people around like a sack of potatoes. It is phenomenal. But it's sort of in this weird place now where African martial arts or martial arts from Africa and the diaspora are starting to get more recognition, first off as existing and secondly as being valid. I mean, I've taught a ton of seminars on Egyptian stick fighting and a couple of seminars on swordsmanship. And, right now I'm teaching a class on spear and shield fighting. And so there is interest. We're still at that phase where people are still wrapping their heads around the fact that this is a thing that exists and there are places you can learn it.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. So, do you think it's kind of or is that just a critical mass thing, or it's been around for, Hamer's, as far as I remember Hamer, has been around for a very, very long time, but really just hasn't gotten near as much attention as Hamer. Do you think that's just a critical mass thing, or do you think it's or is they're growing awareness because they're sort of growing there's more kind of, I guess, pop culture attention played to African culture now? Why do you think it's sort of been taking off more recently?
I have to say it depends on where you are to determine where it's blowing up. I like to give the example of wrestling in Senegal. Wrestling in Senegal 15 years ago was just something a bunch of guys did on the beach and at parties. Now you have packed arenas with 25,000 people, cheering on these fighters. Some of these guys are millionaires now as a result of the popularity of the sport. You have France going down to Senegal to scout some of these young boys to join France's international wrestling team for the Olympics. So, I mean, in a way, there is that importance or approach, but that is more taking an existing traditional art and, ushering it into the mainstream. As far as HEMA versus HAMA is concerned, I would say the HAMA movement, in terms of doing something similar to what HEMA is doing, is probably about maybe 20 years behind. I mean, HAMA has existed because it's a martial art, it's African, and it's historical. But in a way that the HAMA Association has been organizing it, running tournaments, looking through documents, trying to revive it, create classes, professionalize it, modernize it, and mainstream it. That is fairly new as far as the HAMA Association is concerned. I mean, this association specifically has only been around since about 2017. It's a very young organization. But taking the same approach that HEMA has been taking, we're a little bit behind. But because we've been able to sort of mimic what has worked on an organizational level with HEMA and in a historical research approach with HEMA, we have been able to leapfrog a little bit and improve the way that we study, and also improve the way that we practice, and also improve the way that we take what we've studied and what we've practiced, and then how we share that with other people.
Oh, cool. Yeah, and so what do you think? What do you think then are some of the big lessons you learn in that process? What are sort of when you're like, all right, well, how do we professionalize this? How do we modernize it? That sort of thing. What are your kind of, I guess what were sort of the big lessons that you guys learned in that process, do you reckon?
Well, one of the big lessons that I've learned personally, I can say, is the Dunning-Kruger effect is real. It is Pardon?
You too have been on the internet.
Well, it's not just the people that I encounter, but also for myself as well, because there were assumptions and ideas that I had going into the study of historical African martial arts and military history, and the more I learned, the more I realized there is a lot of things that I do not know. And so that has really just improved my curiosity. So, one of the things is understanding that when you research something, historically, one, it may not appear the way that you think it will appear. And secondly, nuance is king.
Yeah.
Nuance is so important, because the more that we've studied, the more we realize that things are interconnected. The more we realize how many different societies interacted with each other, how far did trade networks go? Who knew that in Iran, for example, they had bodyguards that came from East Africa, right?
Yeah.
And how popular that was. Or the fact that Henry Tudor had black people in his court, And it's, you know, and like, how did they get there? What were they doing? And you know, how did this happen? Because you know, as we come through popular culture, we get a certain perspective of what history looked like. And the more that we study, the more we realize that it was far more colorful, nuanced, and connected. In terms of professionalizing it, looking at things like adding gear. In a lot of traditional African martial traditions, you don't practice with gear, you don't spar with gear, and you either sink or swim by your ability. So, you know, you could, you know, and that also gives you a healthier respect for the weapon when you get, you know, hit with a stick, so that when somebody is swinging a sword at you in the same way, you already have respect for that weapon. You know, building tournaments. When we held our first tournament, we actually looked at the rules for existing HEMA competitions, and we adapted those to what we were trying to achieve in that tournament. I mean, obviously the rule sets were not exactly the same, because they had to adjust for the arts themselves and the weapon sets and what we were trying to get out of that tournament. But the whole idea of, you know, getting 2 invigilators and 1 judge, and you know, having one person with the stick to say, you know, stop hitting each other, and how you call hits, and all of that was kind of were things that we learned going through the process, looking at how HEMA developed. And so in terms of professionalizing, there was a lot that we learned from the HEMA community that has sort of leapfrogged our process.
That's really, really cool. That's kind of it's just kind of nice. You're like, oh, you know, having, you know, like having those resources there that can then be taken and adapted is just, that's really, really cool. Something actually was I've been wondering about, since you mentioned you did North African stick fighting. You sort of touched on there where you say, talked about you know, people of African descent in Tudor England. Do you ever see any overlaps between European and African martial arts, like from kind of an African, like I guess from the African end? Because I mean, there is a bit like European, from the European perspective, there is certainly like overlap. Like there's not clean delineation. And what got me interested with the North African stick fighting is one of the sources I look at, Alexander Ville, talks about having studied stick fighting in North Africa, and given he was a French soldier, it probably would have been Egyptian stick fighting. So yeah, do you see much, like, do you see influences the other way as well?
In short form, yeah, we do. I can give you a couple of examples. The types of firearms that were used during the age of gunpowder. You know, the arquebus that would have been bought from Spanish merchants and Italian merchants that was used by the Moroccan armies. The pistols that were used by Barbary pirates largely were either of European design or came from Europe. You know, you have other things like the weapons that the Mamluks and Ayyubids and the Ayyubid, well, Mamluks, there were Ayyubid Mamluks, but you know, some of the shields, for example, kite shields were used. That and you wouldn't expect. Then because we have this common conception that, you know, round shields, for example, were used in North Africa, in the Middle East, but kite shields were very popular. You know, the fact that well, exactly. And even here's a really good example. You actually have moves that are named after places where they come from. So for a specific technique, as an example, there is a block with your spear called the Syrian block that's used in Mamluk horse lance fighting. And the text in Tahtib actually refers to it as having come from the Rome, which is who they would call the Romans. But mind you, by the Middle Ages, the Western Roman Empire was not a thing, so they were actually referring to the Byzantines. So there is a specific technique that they mentioned by name that was appropriated or learned from the Byzantines that now becomes a core part of the basics of fighting on horseback with a lance.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really cool. Because yeah, I mean, it was like you're saying before, we have this idea, you know, we sort of go into this with this kind of idea that there's very, very sort of strict delineation between martial traditions, and then you go in and you're like, actually, yeah, but these people have had contact for hundreds of years. I mean, like, you know, so, you know, I mean, the Moors, you know, were up in Spain and even to southern, you know, and even you know, coming into southern France and in Spain for hundreds of years. There's African immigration to Europe has been going on for a very, very long time. I mean, like the example of like King Henry VIII's court having black people in it. It's because like there was just a really, really large African population in England at the time. Like, there's this huge kind of cultural interchange. It's kind of really interesting to see that. Okay, well, there's transfer of martial arts as well, which is really, really cool. I guess also, so within that, like, with like specifically the Egyptian stick fighting, what sort of, you mentioned Tahtib, which I think it's like a two-handed stick. It's,
yes.
Yeah. So is it just that, or is there? So I've heard reference things like double stick fighting and single-handed stick. Like, what is actually, like, what sort of is actually practiced as part of that tradition?
Okay, so Tahtib, the full name of it, as it's known popularly, is Fan al-Nazaha wa Tahtib. It's a stick fighting system that currently so there's two types actually. So you have, well, three. I'll explain. So the first, you have sort of the dance style, which is a two-stick dancing style, right? And it's just a fancy way of showing off the sticks and throwing them around. It looks great. The music is wonderful. The outfits are really comfortable. Awesome. Then you have, and that particular style was actually popularized in the 1960s. Then you have Tahtib, that is considered to be traditional, and this is what is currently practiced in Upper Egypt. This is the particular system that has lasted going all the way back to the pharaohs. These are the people who maintained that tradition going all the way back 5,000 years. And over time, it went from a stick fighting system that was used in military training camps to now just sort of a thing that guys do drinking tea in the afternoon on a Saturday when they have nothing better to do, or there's a wedding going on, or whatever else. And it demonstrates prowess as a stick fighting teacher. Then the third type you have is Modern Tahtib. Modern Tahtib is the product of my teacher, Dr. Adel Boulad, who traveled Upper Egypt for several years. And over the course of the time in his research, he went to the different villages and picked out the different techniques, because what ends up happening is they were practicing these techniques in isolation. So what may be happening in a place in Aswan may not be done in Luxor. So he went and found out what they were doing in Aswan, found out what they were doing in Luxor, found out what they were doing in other different places, and he brought them all together into a complete system. So now he sort of took all the broken pieces of Egyptian stick fighting and made them back into one. Wow. And so for that particular art, it's based on 4 principles, which you actually find on the Abusir necropolis. There is striking from the rear, which refers to power generation and mechanics, defending your head, which, considering that this is an unarmored and gear-free martial system, is very important. You have movement, which is connected to the fact that you have no gear and you have no armor. And the third is aggression. So it's called touch my body or don't mind the stick, meaning that you're not fighting the stick, you are actually fighting the person who is holding the stick, which is how you should approach when you attack and defend yourself. And so those 4 principles not only are ubiquitous in the tradition of Tahtib that is practiced in Upper Egypt, but you also actually find it in other stick fighting forms in North Africa as well.
Oh, wow.
And that largely is because of its age, because you do something for 5,000 years and your society is existing for 5,000 years, people around you are going to pick that up. But you see other forms that are similar to it, like Donga, which is a stick fighting system in southern Ethiopia, where you still see many of the same principles being applied, just with a much larger stick on a naked guy. So it's just interesting to see that setup. But essentially, in a nutshell, that is my explanation of what Tahtib is.
Cool. So yeah, so very very long running tradition, and do you think, and like from the sounds, I think very, very consistent as well. Do you think that's just because the weapon has remained consistent for so long, or is it or is there another aspect to that consistency, like that effort to sort of preserve it?
I think there's 2 reasons. The first is, I think, because the weapon has stayed consistent. I mean, it's almost become kind of a joke with Egyptians when you ask them about hitting somebody with a shoma, which is one of the words that they have for the stick. But the other aspect of it is Egypt is a country that values its traditions, especially when you go to the south. And so there are people there who are farming on land that their families have been on for the last 1,000 years. And so there is just this, and there are certain ways that they will, and I'm trying not to speak for a group of people that I am not part of, but there is a sort of a sense of community culture and social organization that has essentially maintained this sort of a similar or the same setup for a very long time, irrespective of whatever social changes happened in the other parts of Egypt or in the country overall. So these pieces and that love for their culture and tradition have sort of maintained that, have sort of kept that alive.
Okay, yeah. So and it sounds like it's actually something that's really, really important to them as well, which is really, really cool, and really, really cool. That sort of like that's really being explored and developed. That's really awesome. So we're going to actually sort of ties into a question that we got from the audience. I thought I'd quickly highlight that if people want to ask questions, just put them in the chat and we will get to them eventually. So Siren wants to know, how varied is the opinion on African martial arts? I know in HEMA can be a lot of variation even within people studying the same source. Is the same true of African? So like if do you get people like who have difference of opinions on interpretation of the same source in HEMA, which is that common, or is it more, or is it more people tend to look at their own sources, just look at the one, all sort of look at very different sources?
Well, it's a really good question, actually. I'll start by saying the HAMA community is still fairly small. And so, and because a lot of the people who are coming into it are coming from different perspectives, different martial arts, we do have variation in the way certain things are approached. So, we have differences in maybe what the mechanics of using this particular sword should be. And the fewer sources we have on a subject, and this includes, when I talk about sources, I include living practitioners as part of that. The more variation you will find. The other thing is, even with some of the living arts, you have variation in how they're practiced. A really good example I can give is Mohengi, which is a kickboxing system from Madagascar. And the way it works in general, and I'll sort of give the 10,000-foot view, is you have different clans or different houses where people will go and study. If you think of it kind of like a kung fu movie, where you have this place does crane style, and this place does tiger style, and this place does like mantis style. That's kind of the idea, but they're not calling it crane and mantis and whatever else. It's all kickboxing, but the approach is different, and you can tell what schools somebody comes from by the way that they will fight. The basic moves are the same. So, the different punches and the kicks and all of those are the same, but the way that they're applied, or maybe some of the mechanics that are used, are different. And you can tell which schools cross-train with other related martial arts versus the ones that don't. And you can tell which schools or which clans or houses have a more developed fight cap and ones that don't. And so you'll see a lot of variation in that approach. But there are some, like modern Tahtib, for example, where there's a manual, and there's only really one way to do things. So you either, if you do this set of moves or this set of movements, then yes, you are doing modern Tahtib. If you do these sets of movements, you are not doing modern Tahtib. You're doing something else. And so it's a wide variation depending on the specific art. Some are a bit less centralized, and some of them are very centralized.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting as well. You're talking about how there's a lot of variation in like even the living traditions. I think that's something that we don't take into account very well with historical martial arts, is that like actual martial arts in the world have a huge amount of variation in practice. Like you can go. I mean, like you see it even like like boxing gyms and like Olympic fencing clubs. There's variation. There's a lot of variation just in that, and I kind of wonder how much of like the disagreements you see in HEMA about interpreting the sources are more just an expression of the natural variation you get in martial arts, sort of as is. That's really cool. So we've got another question. So I think this goes back to sources. So Mick wants to know, are there other sources in English other than Swordsmen of the British Empire? So anecdotal sources. So yeah, what's what sources are there in English? If I'm assuming Nick's asking from the perspective of someone who wants to read up on African martial arts.
So, well, it depends on the art that you're looking for. For example, if you are looking at Mamluk spear work, the Mamluk Lancer is available. There's that journal that I mentioned. I have to find the name. It's like the program of the Faculty of Mamluk Studies or something like that. It's a journal that I read every now and again. You can also look at let's see, I'm trying to think what else is good. Well, there's the Mamluk Project. We actually released our 2020 progress report a couple of months ago that contains about 40 pages worth of horsemanship and spear exercises. There is, I'm just trying to think what else you could look at. You can also, so again, it really depends on the art, because there are various different sources that you can look at, but it would have to be specific to what art you're looking for. Tahtib, for example, has a manual called Modern Tahtib, the Egyptian, the word is in French in my head, but it should be in English. So the Egyptian festive art and bâton de combat. But that's the, sorry, my Canadian is showing. But
yeah.
It's like, what is the word in English? But that is available in English, French, and Arabic. So you can actually order that online. So that's another source if you're looking for Egyptian stick fighting. There is an individual by the name of Scanlon, who I think it's George Scanlon, who has a Muslim Manual of War, and this is sort of generally for the Swana region, and it's all about it's sort of a 10,000-foot view of how to wage war in an Islamic way. So this would be everything from choosing your spies to siege equipment to troop movement, choosing bodyguards and mercenaries and where to place them. So that is available in English. I mean, there are quite a few sources available in English. I think I mentioned earlier, Fighting for Honor is another good one as well. So these all can give you a window into it. If you're looking for traditional stories, which are also a tool that we use to study not just if we can't get specific techniques out of it, we do learn about the martial priorities. A good example, the Egyptian tale of the hero Sinuhe, where there's a scene where he's fighting with an opponent, and there's a line saying that he made his opponent's spear chase him, which ties back to one of the principles of Egyptian stick fighting, which is movement. And if you look at many of the unarmored martial systems in North Africa, movement is a huge part of it, because you're trying not to get hit because you are not wearing armor. So some of the stories validate the principles of the martial traditions that we're trying to study.
Cool. Yeah, and I mentioned it also give you a bit of like the social context as well, which I think is really, really important. Certainly in HEMA, one of the things we sort of neglect is looking at how different martial arts we study, were practiced and existed in society. Like, we tend to sort of go, okay, well, who were they fighting? Well, what was happening on the battlefield? But going back a very, very long way, the primary purpose of swordplay in society was as recreation. People would get their swords and just go and muck around with them, or grab some sticks and just play at sticks of an afternoon because they had nothing. They had free time. That's kind of running with African martial arts. I know you mentioned before that stick fighting was done at weddings. What are some of the actual sort of social contexts for different African martial arts? Was it how much of it was leisure? How much of it was self-defense? How much of it was preparation for war? How much of it was just had traditional and kind of cultural purposes? What just sort of, I know that's a really, really big question, because there's a lot of, we're talking about a very, very diverse continent. And yeah, just but even in terms of the martial arts you're most interested in, how do they actually exist in society?
Well, there are various different ways to approach it, which is funny because I actually did a TikTok video about this a couple of days ago. So, the context varies depending on the culture, depending on the art, and depending on the context. So, for example, you have some martial arts that were relegated to only military training camps. For example, Zulu Ikhwa fighting, right? Shaka Zulu's famous short spear, that was for the military training camps. This was not something you did for fun. But on the same note, Zulu stick fighting, or they also call it Nguni stick fighting, this was something that was done recreationally. So it was done to prepare for war, but it was also a recreational thing that just young Zulu men did. If you look at other things like Furusia specifically was a military martial system. So that is only for people who are getting on horses and firing arrows and stabbing people with lances. That was their thing. But then you have arts like El Matreg, which we believe at least were influenced by the swordsmanship of the Mamluks. And that was recreational. Sometimes guys will get together, they'll have some hot tea, and they'll stick fight with each other, and they'll talk, and that's sort of bonding time with the boys. But on the same note, it has a secondary purpose of now you are able to use a sword or a battle axe or what have you. Other times there are special festivals that are taking place. And so the presence of warriors to demonstrate their prowess and their strength for religious reasons is required. In West Africa, you have, for example, a sword that is called the Sword of Shango, that even though it is a sword that is made of metal, made of iron, I think, it isn't actually used for combat. Instead, it is used for ritual dances that simulate combat. And then for other cultures, like the Surma, for example, they will have, what is the word I want to use? So they have mock wars. So them getting together to do donga is their chance to meet up with a rival clan or a rival ethnic group, and to show the biggest and baddest and strongest men in their community to come out and give them the business with a stick. And then, they come out and, look, we won the wager. We're going to take all your goats. Have a nice day. And that's so the context varies based on the culture, the system, and oftentimes the social class. Because social class is also something to consider. When you look at, for me personally, what I'm trying to study is the martial arts of the common man in North Africa, what your average Joe is going to get going into battle. And that is obviously informed by what people like the Mamluks would have, but the Mamluks were elites. It's the same thing, like if you would look at Fiore or Mayer. These texts were not written for your average Joe. They were written for people with money, power, and influence. People who might have high positions in the military later on because they come from a certain social class, right? The folk arts don't usually get written down. And so that's another thing to consider. So books like Kitab al-Masmun Jami al-Funun is not written for your average Joe. This is written for your elite cavalry, your SEAL Team 6, if you will, of the ancient world. So that's sort of, to tie it off, those are some examples of contexts in which the martial arts would be used.
Cool. And just, it's actually really interesting you point about like class as well, because I think that's something we don't tend to look at a lot. Which, and I guess is really, really interesting to me because I look primarily at the British tradition in Britain. Fencing, there is a very, very long sort of working class sort of single stick tradition that does actually get documented because it became a very, very important sort of important spectator sport up until the start of the 19th century. But yeah, it's sort of, there are a lot of sort of like working class fighting traditions that we know existed and were very, very important, but we don't know anything about them. One that sort of interests me, I guess, as well is all through the Mediterranean, so Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, and there's even some suggestion that into the Middle East and possibly North Africa, knife fighting was really, really important. Like dueling with knives was really, really important. They talk about if you have a dispute with someone, you get a work knife, and you just deal with that. And the one thing that's a really, really common thing, certainly like between Spain through Italy into Greece is you don't want to get cut in the face, because that means that if you get cut in the face, that shows that you're not a very good knife fighter. Whereas getting cut like on the hands is fine, because you're going to get hit in the hands. One thing I've actually been wondering about is, do you see much knife fighting in North Africa, or is it mostly stick?
Knife fighting is definitely a thing. We do have manuals that depict knife fighting. Knife dances are fairly popular, especially among some of the nomadic tribes. So if you look at, for example, some of the people in Djibouti, they have knife dances that are major parts of their culture. The Afar carry knives. It's called a gilet. They will carry that. They still carry it today, actually, as a sidearm next to their AK-47s. But they've been carrying them ever since they've been making iron.
Wow.
So we have those, for example, as examples of knife fighting that exists in North Africa. And Jambia fighting was a thing that was brought by the Arabs into North Africa as well. Ancient Egyptians would, when they would send people to battle, sometimes you would only get a knife going into battle, especially during the Bronze Age.
Wow.
Which would not be great. But it's better than the guy who gets a stick. So there's that. But I guess if you got the stick, you could just hit the guy who has a knife in the hand and take it from him.
I think in that I would actually prefer the stick than the knife. Yeah.
But so knife fighting is definitely a thing. However, when we're looking at settling disputes was usually done with sticks, and that's largely because this was supposed to be a non-lethal engagement. Families would make agreements if there was to be a duel that if somebody dies as a result of this stick fight, that there will be no reprisals. This is something that gets discussed when they talk about the old days of Tahtib in Upper Egypt. But you have examples. For example, there's one from 1598 about the Guanches people, who are indigenous to the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands they're part of North Africa, but they are Spanish territory now. The Spain took it over sometime in the 1500s. And the Guanches people would have their disputes settled by having... have you ever been to... this is kind of how I'll describe it. Have you ever been to a carnival where you have like sort of that joust game where one person stands on a pole and another person stands on a pole, and then you kind of hit each other with sticks until somebody falls off, but they're big padded sticks? It's really popular here in Canada. But basically that's what they did, only they used real sticks. And whoever got knocked out or fell off or broke a finger or what have you, that was the end of it. They lost the engagement and they lose the duel, and the winner preserved his honor. So that was kind of the way that they were able to settle disputes without killing anybody.
And presumably you're on the platforms as well, so that people, like if someone backs off, they fall off, and that's it.
Exactly. So you're stuck on the platform, and you sink or swim by your stick fighting ability alone.
Wow. That's okay. That's interesting. And actually, how much is just like causing someone to back off? Like how important in a lot of those stick duel traditions? How important is that? Like just just getting some making someone or pushing someone out of an area, or making them sort of just back down through threat of being hit with a stick. Like, how is that significant in the dueling tradition? Or
well, definitely in any dueling tradition. You have things where you might sweep at somebody with the stick with a big, haymaker movement to try and create space so that you can set up for another technique. You see that in all types of fencing, saber fencing, longsword, what have you. It's a very common thing through most weapon martial arts. You swing your weapon a bit to create space so that you can, prepare for a different technique or a different approach. But generally with a lot of the stick fighting systems, and I'm speaking in a very general sense, and there are nuances, and I have to, give the caveat that it's not the same for everybody, but one aspect of stick fighting that is very common is that you can win or lose in one of three ways, one of four ways. You can either get knocked out, you could be the first one to bleed, you could break a bone, or you could just give up. And that is generally, for the most part, how many of these stick fighting engagements were resolved. But again, leaving space for arts that don't necessarily apply within those rules.
Yeah, like the kind of is probably variation. I have to ask, just when you have the platform, do people just try and shove the other person off the platform? Like, is that a thing that is that a common technique, or is it mostly about just trying to get them to back off themselves?
From what I understand from the account, and you'll have to forgive me because I don't remember all of the substance of it off the top of my head, but I believe it was, the first person to get knocked off of their platform, or the first person to sort of be too injured to either you're too injured to continue to fight, or you get knocked off of your platform, and that's basically the end of the fight.
Okay, yeah, but you don't get people, or is it so it's separate? Is it separate platforms, or is it the one platform?
It's two separate platforms, so you're basically standing on a pillar.
I see. Yeah, no, I guess my thought sort of is like, is any my experience, any sort of martial art where you can where moving someone out of a space wins you the match very, very quickly sort of turns into a shoving match. I think the one HEMA tournament I was in, I fenced one person who he'd been in a bunch of previous tournaments where you could do that, and so his solution was just to come barreling at me, just trying to knock me out of the area, which is that was an experience. So yeah, I was kind of interested if that's just a common thing, but I guess if you're on the two separate platforms, it'd be a bit harder. How much of it? Out of curiosity, how much of this stuff do you guys recreate? Like, because you've got the gathering this weekend, I think you mentioned, but also imagine when you just have any sort of meeting, do you get platforms and actually try this stuff out, or how much do you try to recreate?
Well, we haven't done any of the guancha stick fighting. Obviously for insurance and safety reasons, that may not necessarily be something we can do, unless you want to go to a carnival and try it on the joust thing that they have there. But things that we do try to create is we do try to use the ceremonial traditions, or the equivalent of when we have major events. So for example, this year we obviously can't have an in-person gathering, but when we did, we would do things like the size of the arena, the size of the circle would be based on what we'd get from modern Tahtib, which is about 10 feet by 10, is about 10 feet around. Then as the tournament, this isn't from Tahtib, but as the tournament sort of whittles down the number of fighters, the arenas get a little bit bigger to give them a bit more room to do their work. Or other things like pouring libations in the circles as an offering to the war god Ogun. While not all of us are practitioners of the traditional, Yoruba pantheon, there still is an understanding that that is the most common way of paying respect to the ancestors who were the ones who created these arts for us to practice today. And so we'll do things like a pouring of libations in order to sort of honor that. We'll do things like the burning of incense, or even the way we'll salute each other before we fight depends on the art. There's the Matreg salute, which is, putting the tip of your stick to the ground. There's the Tahtib salute, where you raise your stick into the Halfaya or Amameya position. There are dances that go along depending on, what have you. And then when we do have our tournaments, there's a lot of drumming and singing of traditional songs and all of that comes along with it. So it's a very vibrant, lively event. We try to bring as many of the different cultures in a way that they can blend together as possible. But if we're strictly talking about the research and the specific arts, we will try to, one, understand the cultures, the context, and the ceremony around it. And if we can practice that ceremony, we will. If we can't, we just, keep our notes and have that information.
Yeah. So it's got kind of like, I guess the equivalent in HEMA would be sort of like, you occasionally see overlap between HEMA and historical reenactment, where people sort of will take aspects of the historical societies and kind of bring them in, or just wear really, really puffy pants. That's really, really cool that you actually got sort of like a big cultural dynamic. I think you also mentioned that with your normal gatherings, you actually have like a feast as part of it as well.
Yes. So the first day of the gatherings, that before COVID, we would get together and have a feast and have a food or a dish that represents one of the 6 regions of Africa that we study. So we would have something that represents the diaspora, something that represents East Africa, North Africa, Central Africa, etc. If it's available at a local caterer. And then, we'll all wear the traditional clothes of the region that we are studying. So we have some guys who come in the full, West African garb. We have other guys who dress like Tuaregs. We have, myself, I'd wear, the formal wear of somebody from North Africa. The whole galabeya and kamis, and sometimes I'd wear the kufiya or a turban, depending. But we will have that, and we'll get together and we'll eat the food and celebrate the cultures. And sort of that is how we sort of honor that thing. It's sort of like, we look at it as sort of like a coming together of the entire continent of Africa as we sit down and share a meal.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really, really cool. So kind of as, like as an extension of those cultural practices, are you starting to see people engaging in kind of like reenactment organizations like the SCA, which has traditionally had a very, very broad geographical focus? Do you finding that like members of your association are also going with that and bringing sort of like doing essentially historical African reenactment in those spaces? Like, is that something that's sort of happening more and more?
Well, we find ourselves in the actual spaces more often. So, for example, our vice president was celebrating with a special event with the Ghanaian community, and they were all wearing the traditional wear, doing the traditional dances, eating the traditional food, and he was there sort of as a welcome representative to partake in the celebrations. We have another member by the name of Sansa, who actually travels to West Africa, where he studies traditional wrestling, and he's learned the language, and he participates in all of their traditional activities, learning the ceremonies with the wrestling, learning the techniques and all of that that's associated. So, we have that on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum with reenactment, there are groups like SCA Africa, SCA Egypt that do exist. You can find them on Facebook, and they do that same thing. They will, well, not necessarily the actual traditions themselves, but they will wear the clothes. They will talk about the culture, sometimes cook the dishes, and all of that. So there is a wide breadth. I wouldn't say that the Hama Association is driving that, because there was an interest in it before we existed, but we do try to participate in that when possible.
That's cool. Yeah. That's really cool. So I've got a question from Mick, just to pull up another audience question. When you're talking about so I just want to know, when you talk about like North, Central Africa and that kind of thing, like what actual sort of regions or countries are you referring to?
So when we talk about North Africa, and I'm going to be very careful with this, because, I have to state, because I love nuance, to quote Matt Easton, context, a lot of these regions have a lot of overlap with the regions that they neighbor. For example, Tuaregs as a community live in both West Africa and North Africa. You have countries like Mauritania that are both in West Africa and North Africa. You have regions like the Sahel that span from Nigeria all the way into Ethiopia. So in that respect, you have that section of overlap. But if we're talking about specific countries, North Africa, we would be looking at Morocco, Mauritania, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt. And then for East Africa, we would look at the Horn, so that's Ethiopia, parts of Sudan. We would look at Somalia, then down the coast, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. Southern Africa, we'd be looking at places like Botswana, Lesotho. We'd be looking at Zimbabwe. Central Africa, we'll be looking at Central Africa, and then also the Congo. The two Congos. We'd be looking at, and we're looking at West Africa. That's Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, Benin. So we generally have a sense of what those would be the countries. And we do have to remember two important things. One, there are 54 countries in Africa that we have to, consider, and some of those countries have groups that migrated to their regions from other regions in Africa. And then we also have to remember that the map of Africa that we're looking at now is as a result of the post-scramble for Africa map redrawing. So the way the maps would have looked, say, 150 years ago would be very different from the way that the maps look now. So we kind of use this as sort of a quick and dirty, this is how it's separated. And then when we talk about the diaspora, we look at places where a large African presence existed as a result of either the transatlantic or trans-Saharan slave network. So we're looking at the places like the Caribbean, countries in South America, the United States, parts of Central America. We're looking at parts of the Middle East. We're looking at some parts of India, depending on what African traditions have survived there. So it's not necessarily that we would look at the martial art of Gatka, and because there are Africans in India, then Gatka is suddenly an African martial art. That's not how we would approach it. We would say, okay, well, we have the Siddhi people who live in India, and this might be their particular martial tradition, and they originally come from this area. What part of what they do came from Africa? What part of what they do come from India? And how do we properly understand the context of them living in that diaspora? And sort of that's kind of how we would approach that.
Yeah, so sort of look. Yes, you're focusing a lot more on sort of connections and kind of and sort of like looking at like maybe points of reference in sort of this continuum rather than strict things, which I guess also kind of goes back to what we are talking about before with the overlap between European and African martial arts, where there's not really a clean delineation. We would consider, say, boxing. Boxing is considered very much a European martial art, but completely forgotten his name. I was actually going to look this up. A lot of head movement, like bobbing and weaving, comes from an African American who, I forget, he was observed. A British general saw him basically getting in a punch up and just completely destroying like three other guys because he could evade their punches so effectively. And so this general's like, oh, you seem like a really good sort. Come back to England, and I'll sponsor you to come back to England. And when he went back to England, he had another career for a while, and then ended up teaching boxing, and that's where we get bobbing and weaving, and that's where head movement first. Which is kind of the interesting thing. It's like, well, which kind of reminded me of what you're saying about how in Tahtib there's a big emphasis on movement and evasion. I'm like, well, is this something that might have been influenced by African martial arts? But yeah, I guess it's really interesting. Like, I guess that's kind of the thing with any kind of history, though. You can't. There is no clean delineation. There is just a continuum. You just have to kind of look at. So I'm going to into that. We're seeing also how much overlap on the subject of how much overlap is there between saber fencing of Eastern Europe and eventually Western Europe compared with shamshi used in Arabic sources. So is that?
To be honest, I'd say quite a bit, and this is why I'll say that. The shamshir itself comes from a group of people from the Central Asian steppe. And so the form, function, and mechanics that they developed for the saber found their way into Africa and found their way into Eastern Europe. So we're looking at two saber systems that adjusted to their own cultural context that come from roughly the same source. So, when I watch, for example, the Cossack reenactors do their swordsmanship demonstrations, I recognize a lot of the movements that they're doing. Oh, wow. And obviously the weapon itself, and sometimes they're actually using a shamshir. They may have a different name for it, but it looks like a shamshir. The hilt is the same design, the pommel is the same design, the blade geometry is the same. It's a shamshir, but they're using it in a way that best fits their cultural and martial context. So, I mean, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that you could look at somebody who does Polish sabla and see something familiar when you look at the way that, for example, an Ottoman Mamluk would approach a weapon that is very similar.
Oh yeah, and sort of that overlap, and part of that sort of contiguous tradition where this group learns from this group, learns from this group. Yeah, interesting. And so what are some other areas where you sort of see those connections, like even just in Africa and the Middle East? Like, are there any sort of like big connections. We're just like, oh wow, yes, everyone, everyone through this entire region does the same thing, or like how common is that?
Let me just think of a really good example.
Hmm.
Sword dances.
Oh.
Sword dances are very popular in especially East Africa and in the Middle East. And it's really important to note that the Middle East and East Africa and North Africa, they had shifting borders back and forth for centuries. So, for example, Yemen used to be part of the Aksumite Empire for a very long time. But then you look at the east coast of Africa, part of that was under the influence of the Omanis and the Yemenis for a very long time. Then you have, of course, the shifting borders for Egypt and all that. So, a really good example of something that is because both is the Khopesh. The Khopesh famously is considered to be an Egyptian weapon, but it actually comes from the Levant.
Wow.
And the Khopesh was brought into Egypt by the Hyksos. And the Egyptians basically took that basic design and then modified it to fit their particular tastes for how they would approach combat and their cultural conventions. Before that, the weapon of the pharaoh was like the axe or the mace, not the Khopesh.
Yeah, it's like I mean, like Egypt has like 1,000 years of history pre-bronze. Like it was, I mean, the pyramids were built using most like copper and stone tools. So yeah, like it's interesting. Yeah, so sort of you've got that sort of continuum. And is it something like, is it just the well, yes, it's not just the weapons, it's also like the martial arts as well, like you're saying with the sword dances. Do you think that's something that, one group does a sword dance and they come in, and then when, a group that they either conquer or interact with copies them, goes, oh, well, we need a sword dance as well, and sort of like, do you think that, is it really, really common that technique, like training, is copied as well as just the weapon?
Well, absolutely, because there's a couple of things to think about, right? If we're talking pre-industrial, pre-colonial periods, there were a lot of nomads, like a lot of nomads. And these nomads would be moving from, one part of the Maghreb all the way into, Iraq. And they'd be moving back and forth. They might intermarry between the different tribes. They may get together and have celebrations. So it may not necessarily be about one group conquering the other, but we're talking about trade, intermarriage, shifting borders between kingdoms. Maybe your kingdom expands or it declines. All of these things would come together. You have things like there's this movement I like to call wobbling the sword. You see this a lot in Sudan, where they will take a sword and they'll just kind of shake it a little bit and then make the blade do sort of like this little thing. But you also see that same movement in parts of southern Arabia.
Oh, wow.
Right? Or even the components for some of the weapons. For example, jambias traditionally are made with rhino horn. Where do you see any rhinoceri in Yemen or Oman?
Zeus.
Right? But you see what I mean? Like that exchange has been constant over time. So this isn't necessarily an argument saying that these are exactly the same people. But the argument that I'm making, or to your point, is that there's just been so much exchange, intermarriage, and cross-border conquest that you're bound to find similarities between one group and the other.
Yeah, and it's interesting with like also the effect that like nomadic peoples would have had. It's like, so I guess kind of like when I compare it to sort of European sword traditions, like I mean you obviously get similarities in the weapons, and you get people like Fiore who traveled, and but you also get like you also tend to get like much more sort of regional, much more regional differentiation. But you're saying sort of like particularly North Africa was very different. It sounds like that constant influx or the constant movement of nomadic peoples probably had quite a huge impact, which is really, really, really cool. So I guess that then begs the question. So with Hamer, like, do you find that, like, how diverse is the modern practice? Like, do you find that people mostly gravitate towards like one or two weapons, and then you've got people on the periphery doing, not like doing other weapons, or is it kind of, or is it like much more, is it more that everyone sort of has their own thing and there's not like a predominant kind of weapon that's practiced?
There seems to be I don't know how I would describe this. Kind of I haven't done the numbers, so I can't give you a percentage. But there seems to be a couple of different camps. You have the biggest camps are people who are interested in the stick fighting martial arts of North Africa, or the swordsmanship of the Sahara and the Sahel. So even chotels have become very popular, and so that would be considered a weapon that might appear in the Sahel, because part of the Sahel is in part of Ethiopia. But so chotels are very popular. Takobas tend to be very popular. Zulu stick fighting actually is really popular. People really enjoy doing that. They find it to be fun. When we had our last gathering, I think that was one of our biggest classes. For people who are just interested in the stick fighting art that Shaka Zulu loves so much.
Yeah.
And then you also have people who are generally interested in, at least from an academic standpoint, the empty-handed arts. But empty-handed arts are much more difficult to learn than weapon arts, because for weapon arts, you can learn a cutting chart, phenomenal, right? But with an art like wrestling, you need somebody to wrestle in order to practice that, and you sort of need somebody to explain to you, well, you're doing that ankle pick wrong, or you're not locking horns properly, or anything like that. So there's generally been a pretty wide divide. I find from my personal experience, Egyptian stick fighting tends to be the most popular. Tahtib has probably been the one martial art I've done the most workshops for by request.
Cool. Yeah, and I guess also back to your point about with the wrestling, how important is it, or how important is it that you've got someone who's doing the same thing back to you? I take it's not like you can sort of try and learn, or learn a bunch of the basics by yourself and then go and test them out at just a regular sort of college wrestling club or something like that. How much, or how necessary do you find that you've got someone to train with who is also doing the same art and will do it back to you when you try and do it to them?
Well, I find with empty-handed arts, there is a lot more nuance to consider. For example, I can practice my North African saber fencing. I can do all my drills at home, and then I can fight somebody who does Hema saber and still achieve a roughly similar result to pressure test my studies, largely because people who practice my style of saber fencing would have fought people who would do a European style of saber fencing. So they would still encounter each other, and so I would still be able to get some value out of that. With learning empty-handed arts, and this isn't speaking from my personal experience, of course, it's different for everybody. But not having a person to actually resist me trying to pull a hip throw, or actually physically lock horns to get my hands in the right position. I can, pretend to do one hand over under, but what am I putting my hand over under, right? I'm not getting that sensitive sense of touch that you need in order to be able to effectively grapple with another person.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's sort of, yeah. So it sort of comes back to you can't practice, you just can't practice the techniques without someone to practice the specific techniques with. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and I guess I've had similar experiences where when I started doing 19th century saber, I ended up fencing a lot of people who did Elizabethan backsword, because that was that's what's popular. Or that's really what's popular in New South Wales. And it was I think it was 4 or 5 years before I actually got to fence someone who would do not even the same systems I was doing, just something similar back to me, which is kind of, I found that was a really, really interesting experience. But still could practice the techniques by myself and go, okay, this is what this is, and this is what this is. So yeah, okay, it's really interesting. So I've got a few more questions from the audience. Let's move on to those. So Syrian wants to know, how does Capoeira compare to the empty-handed arts of Africa? Is there a clear lineage at play, or is it more similar to European wrestling, where the overlap seems to more to do with with biomechanical limitations and a clear lineage?
So I'll try to see if I can properly understand the question. I just want to preface this with Capoeira is considered Hama. And this is because it actually does have roots in Central Africa. Its parent art is Ngolo, and practitioners of Ngolo brought that on the slave ships to Brazil, and that sort of was the genesis of capoeira. There is a lineage. Lineages, if you know enough capoeiristas, they will tell you how important a lineage is. They will tell you if they studied under, this mestre, who studied under this mestre, who studied under Mestre Bimba or Mestre Bezuru, who are, important figures in capoeira, especially considering the fact that for a long time it was banned in Brazil. To the point that people would be having a roda, it would get run over by police, and the mestres would get shot.
Wow.
So the lineages are very important for arts like capoeira. So you do have existing lineages for that. For a lot of the other empty-handed arts, yes. So you literally have clans or houses that people will represent when they go to events. So, for example, Dambe fighters will come from a particular house where they would have studied. For arts like Morengi, again, you come from a particular house or a particular clan, and that would be who you would represent when you go out to fight. So for many of the empty-handed arts in Africa specifically, you do have lineages or houses that you would study under. In the diaspora outside of capoeira, you have arts like 52 blocks. And you do have lineages for 52 blocks where you can point to, I studied under, Light Burley, for example. And, Light studied under this person who studied under this person, and that is where that lineage begins. So empty-handed arts do have lineages, but it depends on what that art is. I'm not going to speak on the empty-handed arts I'm not familiar with, so the ones that I am familiar with do have lineages.
Okay, cool. Yep. And so some of those lineages go all the way back, or can be traced, back to sort of, all the way back to Africa, and sort of, so you can actually, you've got a way of tracing continental African influences on diaspora arts.
Right.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. Yeah, and I guess it also sort of goes back to what you're saying as well about how all of these arts are important as a way of sort of preserving tradition. You've got that lineage, and you've got that way of kind of keeping, maintaining communities. Even quite adverse circumstances. It's just, seems kind of interesting. It seems really full on with capoeira that masters were shot and it was broken up. There was also the thing was the dancing element was kind of as a way of disguising it, wasn't it?
Yes. So capoeira, so you have actually two major types of capoeira, and I'm going to be careful because I myself am not a capoeirista. So, if there are any capoeiristas out there who found that I said anything incorrectly, I apologize.
Just say in the comments.
So mainstream capoeira, you have capoeira regional and capoeira Angola, sorry. So capoeira regional is what people are most familiar with, and that's the one where they're jumping and they're flipping and doing all those power moves. And then capoeira Angola is a bit more, it's slower and uses a lot more and demonstrates a lot more positions. It's a lot more about demonstrating your prowess to be able to hold the various guard positions, etc. And so, in a way, yes, they were masked in a dance. And dance is very essential to African martial arts in that it was often used as a pedagogy. So, by learning the dance moves, you end up, as a result, learning different movements that are associated with the art. So, for capoeira and many of the other arts in the diaspora, these ended up turning into dances because they were less likely to be assailed by the masters or the political superstructure that did not want them to have any forms of being able to exist.
Yeah, wow. And so, does that kind of mean did the dances sort of function the same way katas do in Eastern martial arts, where it's a way of a way of doing sort of prescripted movements?
Yes, actually. Now, for capoeira, I can't really speak to that directly because, again, I did some capoeira, but not a lot of it. But I can speak to Egyptian stick fighting that has a similar mindset. And so there are a lot of the dances that are in Egyptian stick fighting that actually have the techniques embedded in them. So there's a movement, for example, called the small horse, which is actually footwork for taking you offline when somebody is attacking you. And that is a way of giving up the center line and setting yourself up for a riposte. You have other movements like the large horse, which helps you practice slipping your leg by doing that dance movement. So within the dances there are those specific techniques embedded, and as you learn the dances, you end up learning the techniques, and they almost become automatic or part of your muscle memory.
Wow, yeah. So that's really cool, and that seems to be a common thread through a lot of African martial arts. From what you're saying, that like it's very much linked with those like the sword dance traditions you're talking about. That's really, really cool. All right, so I'll just check if there's any more sort of audience questions. I guess, while waiting for people to type anything more or for me to think up another question, what are some things that, like, if you had to pick, like, a few things that you wanted everyone to know about HEMA, just, or like common, myth busting, or even just like cool things that you think everyone should know, what would they be?
Well, the first thing is that it exists. It is a thing. People do it. I think, secondly, that these are valid martial systems that have very deep cultural significance and very intricate techniques. And third, that they're a lot of fun. I mean, it exists. They're a lot of fun, and the techniques are interesting, and there's so much history behind it. So that is essentially what I would like to say about people about HEMA if they want to learn something very basic about what it is and why it's a good thing to learn.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, I was in the comments, there's a few people who there's a few comments from people saying that they wish there was like a HEMA club close to them, and it's like, actually, within that, if you're interested in HEMA, but we're near any other practitioners, what can you do to sort of get involved or to engage with it?
Well, the first thing that they can do is join the Facebook group that the HEMA Association has. That gives you access to over 5,000 practitioners, weapon makers, masters, researchers, and enthusiasts. So you can go into that hive mind and ask a question. Do you have a source for this? And somebody in there will have an answer. If there is no source for it, they'll give you some direction as to how you can get started. The second, I would say, is get a dedicated group of people that you can commit to practicing with, and select a specific art or tradition that you like. So if you are really interested in Mamluk Egypt, if you are really interested in Senegalese wrestling, if you're really interested in Zulu stick fighting, pick that art. So pick out something specific, and then you can, after connecting with the community, developing a group of your own, then look up whatever sources you can find. The good thing is a lot of these arts do have videos of people practicing them on YouTube. So if you spend the time, you can pick out the various combinations that people are using in those arts. And if you're looking for a name, you want to know, what is the name of this particular movement that they do? Ask the hive mind. Either somebody will know, or they'll know somebody who will know. And then that way you will be able to say, okay, well, this movement is called an Unujikiliza, and that's a rap shot. And now we can practice doing rap shots. And then eventually, as you practice and you develop, then, as a group, you sort of develop your own local style of the same art. And then just go out and pressure test. Fight. That is the answer. That's been the answer for me. Because for me, largely, I've done a lot of my own study through the group, through practicing the exercises that I get from looking at either related systems or through some of the video sources that I've been able to get, and through some of my instructors. And then I take everything that I've drilled and everything I've practiced, and then I find a bunch of people who are doing sword things, and I fight them. And afterwards, I do a bit of a post-op, and I say, okay, well, I tried this technique and this technique, it didn't work. Why didn't this technique work? Or in the middle of sparring, I managed to pull this particular movement off. What did I do leading up to that to make that possible? And then you just take that back to the drawing board, and you rinse and repeat. And also spend some time learning about the cultures of the martial art that you're studying. Because sometimes embedded in the culture, you will find dances, you will find stories, you will find anecdotes, you will find particular rituals that you need to practice. For example, for Morengi, I bring this up as an example a lot. Being circumcised is very important if you want to be a fighter. I mean, I don't know who's willing to get snipped, but that's something to consider, right? So if you want to, for example, do Morengi where you are and you're not part of the snippet club, then that's great. But if you want to go to Madagascar, understand that you may not be able to enter the circle if you haven't. Right?
Yeah.
So it's just trying to understand those things.
Yeah, like there's sort of this whole kind of cultural context. I think I think that's like just a really good comment in general for any kind of historical martial arts is look into the culture surrounding it. Like actually understanding these where these traditions and where these systems kind of came from. Like don't just take it for granted. To me, like I guess to draw a comparison with HEMA, with HEMA, like I find a lot of people are very, very interested in the sword fighting, but don't know very much about say medieval history or like 19th century history or whatever. Like haven't actually looked at anything sort of beyond that. My pet peeve, my favorite one is when people start talking about the difference between like battlefield arts and sportive arts. In the Middle Ages when the tournament was hugely important for knights, like and the way you like. As far as they were concerned, a tournament was just a more polite form of warfare. They did not see that as a delineation. The difference was the same. The difference was the same as the difference between like a skirmish and a mass battle. That's really, really cool. Like, I guess you comment that people should actually go out and engage not just with like the specific martial art, but also with the culture as well. So I've got a few more questions just popping up. So Mick asked about this before with English language sources for African martial arts, and you did mention a few. So what I might actually suggest is if you want to post them in the Facebook event after this, and once you've done that, I'll put them also in the comment on the YouTube broadcast. So that way, people can find out more about this because I think just judging from
I'll do you one better. So I'll do you one better. The Historical African Martial Arts Association has a whole page that is actually a reading list of suggested sources and materials. I can just give you that link, and there's probably close to 100 books in there.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, that'd be great. Just having, take a while to get through, but yeah, really, really cool. All right, cool. I think that's rounding out for comments, so we might finish here. Just before we end the stream, is there anything you want to add or anything you want to say? It's mostly answering my questions and audience questions. So I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about before we go.
Certainly. So I would invite you all to check out the Historical African Martial Arts Association's YouTube channel tomorrow. We'll be having our annual gathering. It's from 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll have seminars, classes. There'll actually be a live class from Trinidad and Tobago on Trinidadian stick fighting, also known as Kalinda. There'll be a lecture on, I believe it is on Sahelian combat, but I have to double check because I'm not the one delivering the paper. And we'll also be announcing the winners of this year's Tournament of Champions. So if you do have an opportunity to come, check that out. If you want to learn a bit more about the Mamluk Project, please visit the Ham Association's website. We have a public record of everything that we've learned so far, including the whole bit on explosives, which is interesting.
Explosives?
I should probably mention. Now that I've mentioned it. So, in the book that we're translating, there was a whole section on chemical warfare and incendiary weapons, including some recipes for things that go boom. So we are we're in the process of translating that section, and we've learned some interesting things. One example I can give you is there's this cone that they would have. I think it's made of wood or the material I'm not fully certain of, but it's full of a chemical that is not too different from burning phosphorus or sulfur. And what a rider would do is he would ride up in front of the enemy lines and just throw this burning chemical on top of them. Just throw it on them. There's a whole other section on exploding arrows, and there was another bit on I forget what the specific term for it is, but basically a knight would cover himself and his horse in fireworks, light himself up and the horse, and ride straight at the enemy cavalry. The idea is that this man and horse on fire being covered in explosions would scare the enemy's horses, and they would run in the other direction or just run into chaos to sort of burst up the enemy lines. There are other things like liquids that you can put on a stick for hardening it so that it can actually break a leather helmet, because leather helmets were a thing.
Wow.
Because I mean, who wants to wear metal in the middle of the desert, really?
Yeah.
But cook your brain. But so like there are examples of things like that, and we're still learning about this explosive section. We have a feeling that there might be recipes for things that we thought we had lost the recipes to, but because we haven't finished that section, we're not 100% certain. So I don't want to make any grand declarations like, "Oh, we found the recipe for Greek fire," because we don't know. We haven't finished reading it.
Yeah.
But it's just this whole section is interesting. We actually have been sort of in a bit of a moral quandary as to whether or not we should translate this, because then we basically have participated in teaching people how to make explosives, and yikes.
Bit taboo.
It's a bit
big. Yeah. Wow. I mean, yeah. So, well, when we first thought it was how, even if you translate it, how would you test that stuff? Let's. Yeah,
I live in Canada. I'll get arrested.
Maybe some some if there's practitioners in the US where it's a little bit less taboo, maybe. Wow, yeah, no, that's really cool. It so there's like a whole section on just essentially murder chemistry. That's awesome.
Yes, murder chemistry. That's a really good way of putting it. I mean, when the translator said, "Hey, we found a recipe for exploding arrows," I'm like, "Exploding what? Why would you want arrows to explode? That doesn't make." Oh, I mean, could you imagine somebody? It just I'm imagining some poor soul on the battlefield fighting the Mamluks. He gets an arrow in his armor, and he's like, "Whew, wow, that could have been so much boom."
Yeah, or just you mentioned also like the effect on like formations as well, so I mean that's the thing. Like in European warfare, they talk about like arrows or like archers being about like area denial, but like just shooting a bunch of arrows into an area so that your enemy has to move. But imagine if those arrows exploded, that would just be terrifying.
Well, and you can imagine if you're your average Joe who isn't around this stuff very often, they just got pulled off your farm, or you've never seen fireworks in your life, and all of a sudden they're throwing things that explode at you. I mean, it's not a good day.
It'd be terrifying. It'd be utterly terrifying. Cool. So we're finishing off. I thought this would just be a really, really cool question to finish off on. What's the coolest technique you've ever done in HEMA? Or it's the coolest thing you've ever or even just like a top 3.
Okay, so wow, that's a big one. Okay, so there is a sword combination that I do. I mean, it's one that I came up with myself based on my research, and it's called rocking the cradle. And so the way that this works is you do what's called a tarsha barania, which is like an outside cut, and you are cutting in towards your opponent, but it's actually faking them out. So what you end up doing is you're cutting, they will commit to trying to intercept your sword, but right in the middle, just before you connect, you bring the sword up here, and then you turn your arm again to cut at the back of their arm. So it's sort of take this block, nope, boom, you got you cut the arm.
Really
there was one that I did manage to pull off. I actually pulled off a disarm in a saber match, where half swording a saber is absolutely a thing that you can do, and oftentimes that's something that people tend to forget because they're very, trying to keep the distance. But if you're looking at it from a battlefield art perspective and not a fencing perspective, half swording is great because it doesn't tire your arm out. But basically, it's moving in, catching the blade, tipping yours, and then pushing the cross guard or the knuckle bow of your blade into your opponent's hand until they have to let go of their sword. Now you have two swords.
So you just arms on it, their own sword. That's very cool.
Yeah. So I mean, those were a couple. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that I really. So there's another movement in Egyptian stick fighting where you fake like you're doing a full strike, sort of this way, just your standard. I guess I don't know what you would call it in longsword, but it's just like a standard strike to the side of the head. But at the last minute, you turn your arms and you strike at the back of your opponent's head. So it's a full turn, and then you take the stick and you flip it. And then what you end up getting is around your opponent's guard, and then you end up hitting them in the back of the head. So those are basically some of my favorite techniques in Hama. So you have that feint rocking the cradle where you're cutting the arm. You've got the disarm, and then there's wrapping the stick where you turn it at the last minute as you walk past your opponent and just tag them in the side of the head.
Wow, that's very cool. I'll have to try that next time I do anything two-handed. That sounds really cool. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really interesting. Like I really enjoyed the talk, and gather a lot of other people have as well. So yeah, really thank you for doing this, especially given how late I think it's like well into the evening where you are. So yeah. And yeah, definitely. I'll do send me that reading list, and I'll post it to the event and also put in the comments and put in the description of the video here, so that people can check out more about Hamer, and hope hope the gathering is great, and we'll see each other again soon.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, we are Facebook friends now, so
yes,
you know where to find me.
Exactly. Definitely. All right, cool. Yeah. Well,
thank you for having me.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Take care.